An old woman kneels quietly at a soldier's grave, placing fresh flowers with care. A loud teen walks by with friends, laughing and mocking her from a distance. He kicks over the vase of flowers, smirking as she gasps and clutches her chest. Then, Chuck Norris appears behind him, grabs his shirt, and stands still, calm, unshakable, and ready. Welcome to Chuck Norris Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The late afternoon sun, a painter of long shadows and golden hues, cast a melancholic glow over the gently rolling hills of Willow Creek Memorial Park. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind through ancient oak trees and the distant, mournful coo of a mourning dove. Headstones, weathered by time and seasons, stood in neat, solemn rows, each a silent testament to a life lived, a story concluded. Here, amidst the quietude, Eleanor Ashton, a woman whose silver hair was plaited with the threads of 70 graceful years, knelt before a simple granite marker. Engraved upon it was a name, Captain James R. Ashton, followed by dates that bracketed a life of courage and a love that time had not diminished. Her gloved fingers, gnarled slightly by arthritis but still capable of tender gestures, traced the cold, carved letters of his name, a familiar ritual that brought both comfort and a fresh pang of loss. She had been coming here every week for the past 5 years, since James, her beloved husband of nearly half a century, had finally succumbed to an illness linked to his long and distinguished military service. Today, like every other visit, she brought a small bouquet of freshly cut gardenias, his favorite, their sweet, heavy fragrance a poignant counterpoint to the earthy scent of damp soil and old stone. She arranged them carefully in a modest vase set before the headstone, her movements slow, deliberate, each gesture an act of devotion. Her face, lined with the map of a life richly experienced, was serene, though a deep sadness resided in her clear blue eyes. She wasn't one for overt displays of grief, not anymore. Her sorrow was a quiet companion, a constant ache that had become a part of her, like the steady beat of her own heart. She spoke to him softly, her voice a low murmur, sharing the small news of her week, the antics of their grandchildren, the stubborn refusal of her prize-winning roses to bloom on schedule. It was a one-sided conversation, yet it felt essential, a way to keep his memory vibrant, to maintain the connection that death had tried, but failed to sever. A little ways off, seated on a weathered stone bench beneath the sprawling branches of an old maple, another figure observed the quiet dignity of the scene, though his gaze was mostly directed towards a worn copy of a history book resting in his lap. He was an older man, dressed in simple, unassuming clothes, a faded denim jacket, work trousers, and sturdy, well-worn boots. A baseball cap, pulled low, shadowed his features, but the lines of a life lived with purpose and a certain quiet intensity were evident. He seemed to blend into the somber landscape, another soul seeking solace or remembrance in this city of the silent. This was Chuck Norris, though no one in the cemetery that afternoon would have recognized him as such, nor did he invite any such recognition. He often sought out places like this, places where the noise of the world receded, allowing for reflection, for a quiet communion with the echoes of the past. He wasn't visiting any particular grave today. He was simply present, absorbing the atmosphere of peaceful sorrow, a silent witness to the enduring power of love and memory. He noted Eleanor's solitary vigil, the gentle care with which she tended the grave, and he felt a sense of respect for her quiet devotion. Such scenes were a balm to a soul that had witnessed too much of the world's clamor and conflict. He was not aware, not yet, that this particular afternoon's peace was about to be rudely, callously shattered. The tranquility of Willow Creek Memorial Park was abruptly fractured by a discordant burst of noise. Laughter, loud and grating, punctuated by the thumping bass of music from a portable speaker, rolled across the manicured lawns, a profane intrusion into the sacred stillness. A group of 4 teenagers, 3 boys and a girl, swaggered through the main gates, their movements imbued with the careless arrogance of youth convinced of its own immortality and importance. At their lead was a youth named Ethan, his hair styled into aggressive spikes, a smirk plastered on his face as if it were a permanent fixture. He carried the speaker, its volume cranked to a level that made the ground beneath Eleanor's knees seem to vibrate. His companions, a youth with a perpetually bored expression named Kyle, a smaller, wiry boy named Leo who seemed to live for Ethan's approval, and a girl, Maya, whose bright pink hair and heavy makeup seemed defiantly out of place in the somber surroundings, trailed in his wake, their own voices loud and unthinking. They were, it seemed, looking for a place to hang out, a place where they wouldn't be bothered, and the quiet, sparsely populated cemetery apparently fit their criteria for an edgy, unconventional gathering spot. Eleanor flinched as their raucous approach shattered her quiet communion with James. She looked up, her serene expression troubled by a flicker of annoyance and dismay. This was a place of respect, of remembrance. Their behavior felt like a desecration. She tried to ignore them, to refocus on her husband's grave, but their presence was too invasive, their noise too persistent. They settled not far from where she knelt, choosing a large, ornate mausoleum as a backdrop for their impromptu party, its stone angels and grieving cherubs now unwilling witnesses to their youthful irreverence. Ethan placed the speaker on a flat tombstone, the heavy bass causing the very stone to thrum. Leo immediately started an exaggerated, mocking dance, while Kyle pulled out his phone, presumably to document their cool outing for social media. Maya, after a cursory glance around, plopped down on the edge of another grave, pulling out a can of energy drink. Chuck Norris, from his bench, observed their arrival with a deepening frown. The disrespect was blatant, an affront to the sanctity of the place and the sensibilities of anyone seeking solace there. He saw Eleanor's visible discomfort, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her quiet murmurs to her husband ceased. He recognized the type, youths mistaking boorishness for boldness, convinced that their fleeting amusement trumped every other consideration. He had seen it before, this casual disregard for the sacred, for the feelings of others. It was a symptom of a deeper malaise, a lack of empathy, a failure of character. He continued to watch, his book now resting unheeded in his lap. His initial purpose of quiet reflection had been supplanted by a growing sense of unease, a premonition that this was not just youthful thoughtlessness, but something that could easily escalate into deliberate cruelty. He hoped he was wrong, but experience had taught him to be a pessimist in such matters. Eleanor tried to recapture her earlier sense of peace, to shut out the jarring intrusion. She bowed her head, her lips moving in a silent prayer, not just for James, but perhaps for a return to the quiet reverence that this place deserved. The gardenias at the foot of the grave seemed to droop slightly, their sweet fragrance overwhelmed by the teenager's cheap cologne and the artificial fruit scent of Maya's energy drink. The harmony of Willow Creek had been broken, and the discordant notes were growing louder. Ethan, clearly the instigator and alpha of his small pack, seemed to thrive on the attention, however negative. He spotted Eleanor, a solitary, vulnerable figure kneeling in quiet grief, and a cruel smirk spread across his face. He saw not a grieving widow, but a target, an object for his particular brand of fun. He nudged Leo, who was still flailing about in his mock dance. "Yo, check out Granny Moses over there." Ethan sneered, his voice loud enough to carry clearly to Eleanor and to Chuck. "What's she doing, praying to the dirt? Think her old man can hear her from down there." Leo snickered, a high-pitched, nervous sound, always quick to validate Ethan's attempts at humor, no matter how tasteless. Kyle lowered his phone for a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps discomfort, perhaps just disinterest, in his eyes, but he said nothing to dissuade his friend. Maya rolled her eyes, but a small, almost complicit smile played on her lips. She took another long swig of her drink. Eleanor's back stiffened. The words, sharp and barbed, struck her with a physical force. She had endured much in her life. The anxieties of James's deployments, the pain of his final illness, the profound loneliness of widowhood, and she had always faced it with a quiet strength. But this casual, unthinking cruelty directed at her most sacred ritual, at the memory of her beloved husband, felt like a fresh wound. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, her fingers tightening around the small, smooth stone she always carried in her pocket, a stone James had given her from a beach on their honeymoon. She would not let them see her cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. Chuck Norris observed the exchange, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The shift from general disrespect for the place to a direct, personal attack on the grieving widow was a significant escalation. He saw the pain flicker across Eleanor's face, despite her admirable attempt to maintain her composure. He saw the smirk on Ethan's face, the thoughtless cruelty in his eyes. This was no longer just youthful irreverence. It was targeted malice. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would have to intervene if this continued. But not yet. He wanted to see how far Ethan would take it, to allow the boy to fully reveal the depths of his disrespect, to give him enough rope, as it were. Sometimes, the most effective lessons were those that allowed the transgressor to fully expose their own folly before the correction was applied. Ethan, emboldened by Eleanor's lack of overt reaction, which he, like most bullies, misinterpreted as weakness rather than dignified restraint, decided to press his advantage. He swaggered closer to where Eleanor knelt, his friends trailing behind him like a pack of hyenas drawn to a potential kill. "Hey, lady," he called out, his tone a mixture of mock politeness and blatant insolence. "You lose something down there? Or are you just really into gardening in graveyards?" He gestured towards a freshly placed gardenias. "Nice flowers, by the way. Did you pick 'em yourself? Or did old What's-His-Name leave you a shopping list before he kicked the bucket?" The cruelty of his words was breathtaking. Leo and Maya sniggered. Kyle, however, looked increasingly uncomfortable, his gaze shifting nervously between Ethan and Eleanor. He seemed to possess a nascent conscience, though it was clearly not strong enough to challenge Ethan's dominance. Eleanor finally lifted her head, her blue eyes, though clouded with pain, meeting Ethan's gaze with a surprising firmness. "This is a place of rest, young man," she said, her voice low and steady, though a slight tremor betrayed her inner turmoil. "A place for remembrance and respect. Your behavior is inappropriate." Ethan seemed taken aback for a split second by Eleanor's direct, albeit gentle, rebuke. He had expected tears, perhaps, or a frightened retreat. Her quiet dignity, her refusal to be completely cowed, seemed to momentarily deflate his bluster. But it was only for a moment. His ego, fragile and demanding, quickly reasserted itself, misinterpreting her composure as a challenge. "Inappropriate?" he echoed, a sneer twisting his lips. "Oh, I'm sorry, Grandma. Did I offend your delicate sensibilities? Is my music too loud for your dead husband?" He deliberately emphasized the word dead, his voice dripping with malice. He then did something that crossed a definitive line, something that moved beyond verbal taunts into an act of direct, physical desecration. He took a step closer to James Ashton's grave and, with a deliberate, contemptuous flick of his foot, kicked at the small vase of gardenias Eleanor had so carefully arranged. The vase toppled, spilling water and flowers onto the grass. Several white petals were bruised and scattered. Eleanor gasped a small, wounded sound. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and a surge of profound, righteous anger. This was not just an insult to her. It was an attack on James's memory, on the sacred space she had created for him. It was an act of senseless, brutal defilement. That was the moment. The precise instant the invisible line was irrevocably crossed. From his bench, Chuck Norris, who had witnessed the entire exchange with a growing, icy calm, rose to his feet. The movement was not sudden, not aggressive, but it was imbued with an undeniable sense of purpose, of finality. He placed his book carefully on the bench beside him. He took off his baseball cap, revealing a full head of silver hair and eyes that, even from a distance, seemed to hold a glint of cold, hard light. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His very posture, the way he stood, straight and unyielding, spoke volumes. The air around him seemed to crackle with a contained energy, a silent promise of impending action. Ethan, still smirking at the scattered flowers, his back partially turned to Chuck, was oblivious to this new presence, this shift in the cemetery's quiet dynamics. His friends, however, noticed. Leo's sniggering died in his throat. Maya's eyes widened, her hand freezing halfway to her mouth with her energy drink. Kyle, who had been looking increasingly distressed, now looked openly alarmed. They saw the older man approaching, no longer a passive observer, but a figure of quiet, formidable intent. He wasn't rushing. His pace was measured, deliberate, each step firm on the soft grass. But there was something in his approach, something in the set of his jaw, in the unwavering focus of his gaze, that sent a chill down their spines. The game, they instinctively knew, was over. The hunter was about to become the hunted, not by a physical predator, but by a moral force, a reckoning that had been slowly, silently gathering in the shadows of Willow Creek Memorial Park. Eleanor, tears now openly streaming down her face, bent down, her hands trembling, to gather the fallen gardenias. She didn't see the man approaching Ethan from behind. She was lost in her grief, in the shock of the desecration, unaware that an unlikely champion was about to intervene on her behalf, and on behalf of the dignity of all who rested there. Ethan, basking in what he perceived as his triumph over the grieving widow, turned to his friends, expecting their usual chorus of admiration. "See? That's how you handle these old fossils," he began, his voice laced with self-congratulatory arrogance. But the words died in his throat. He saw not admiration, but fear in their eyes. Leo was pale, his mouth slightly agape. Maya had shrunk back, looking suddenly small and insignificant. Kyle was staring past Ethan, his expression one of utter disbelief and a dawning terror. Confused, Ethan started to turn, a belligerent "what?" forming on his lips. He never got to say it. Before he could fully pivot, before he could even register the presence behind him, a hand, strong as iron, clamped down on his shoulder, fingers digging into the fabric of his t-shirt and the muscle beneath. The grip was not crushing, not yet, but it was unyielding, a vice of controlled power that rooted him to the spot. Ethan froze, his body going rigid with shock and a sudden, primal fear. He could feel the strength in that grip, the undeniable message of absolute control. "I believe," a quiet voice said from directly behind his ear, a voice that was calm, low, yet resonated with an authority that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand on end, "that you owe the lady an apology. And perhaps you should pick up those flowers." Ethan tried to wrench his shoulder free, but the hand held firm, effortlessly neutralizing his struggles. He twisted his head, his eyes wide and panicked, to see the face of the man who had so suddenly, so completely, taken control of the situation. He saw an older man, yes, but the eyes that met his were not old. They were clear, sharp, and filled with a cold, unwavering disapproval that seemed to pierce right through him. There was no anger in those eyes, no overt threat, but there was something far more unsettling, a profound, righteous certainty, the look of a man who had drawn a line, a man who would not be moved. Chuck Norris didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence, his grip, the sheer, unexpected force of his quiet intervention had completely shattered Ethan's composure. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, rapidly giving way to a very real, very personal fear. Who the hell are you?" Ethan stammered, his voice a mere squeak, all his earlier bravado vanishing like mist in the sun. "My name isn't important," Chuck replied, his voice still calm, his grip still firm. "What is important is your behavior. What is important is respect, a concept you seem to have tragically forgotten, or perhaps never learned." Eleanor, hearing the new voice, the scuffling sound, looked up. Through her tear-filled eyes, she saw the scene. The arrogant boy now held fast, his face a mask of fear, and standing behind him, the quiet stranger from the bench, no longer unassuming, but a figure of undeniable power and moral authority. A small, choked sob of relief escaped her. Leo, Kyle, and Maya stood frozen, like statues, their earlier mockery replaced by a terrified awe. They had never seen anyone stand up to Ethan like this, let alone so effectively, so completely dismantle his aggressive persona with such quiet, effortless control. The power dynamic in their little group, and indeed, in that small corner of the cemetery, had been utterly and irrevocably inverted. The bully, so accustomed to dishing out intimidation, was now experiencing it firsthand, not from a physical threat, but from the unshakable weight of moral condemnation. Ethan struggled again, a desperate, futile attempt to break free from the unyielding grip on his shirt, near his shoulder. "Get your hands off me, old man," he hissed, trying to inject some of his former bravado into his voice, but it came out thin and reedy, laced with an undeniable tremor of fear. He was like a cornered animal, lashing out blindly, his usual tactics of intimidation proving utterly useless against this unexpected, implacable force. Chuck's grip tightened almost imperceptibly, not enough to cause pain, but enough to send a clear, unmistakable message. "You are not in control here." "I will remove my hand," Chuck said, his voice still low and steady, yet carrying an absolute authority that brooked no argument. "When you demonstrate that you understand the gravity of your disrespect. When you show some semblance of remorse for the pain you've caused this lady, and for the desecration of a place that should be sacrosanct." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Until then, we can stand here as long as it takes." The three other teenagers, Leo, Kyle, and Maya, watched in horrified silence. Their ringleader, the one who had always seemed so invincible, so untouchable in his arrogance, was now completely subdued, held fast by a man who exuded an aura of quiet, unshakable power. Kyle looked physically ill, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Leo was trembling, his eyes wide and darting nervously between Chuck and Ethan. Maya had her hand clamped over her mouth, as if to stifle a scream. The lesson was not just for Ethan. It was for them as well, a stark, unforgettable demonstration of consequence. He started it. Ethan blurted out, resorting to the oldest, weakest excuse in the bully's handbook. "She was giving me attitude." "She was grieving her husband," Chuck corrected, his voice tinged with a cold disapproval. "She was in a place of sorrow and remembrance, asking nothing of you but the basic decency of being left in peace. A decency you were clearly incapable of providing." He then applied a slight pressure, turning Ethan more fully to face the grave he had desecrated, to face Eleanor, who was now slowly, painfully, trying to gather the scattered gardenias, her shoulders shaking. "Look," Chuck commanded, his voice no louder, but imbued with an intensity that made Ethan flinch. "Look at what you've done. Those flowers were a symbol of love, of remembrance. You kicked them, you scattered them, as if they were garbage. As if her grief, her love, meant nothing." Ethan's gaze flickered towards Eleanor, then quickly away, unable to bear the sight of her quiet sorrow, a sorrow he had so callously amplified. A wave of something akin to shame, hot and unwelcome, washed over him. It was a new, deeply uncomfortable sensation. I didn't mean to," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Your intentions are irrelevant when your actions are so cruel," Chuck stated flatly. "What matters is the impact, the pain you inflicted, the disrespect you showed not only to this lady and to the memory of her husband, but to every single person who rests in this cemetery and to every person who comes here to mourn them." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This ground is hallowed by grief, by love, by sacrifice. And you treated it like your personal playground, a stage for your pathetic displays of arrogance." The force of Chuck's quiet condemnation was more powerful than any physical blow. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, but he was systematically dismantling Ethan's entire worldview, stripping away his false bravado and exposing the ugly, empty core beneath. Ethan's struggles ceased. He stood limp in Chuck's grasp, the fight completely gone out of him, replaced by a dawning, terrifying understanding of the magnitude of his transgression and the profound, quiet strength of the man who now held him accountable. The silence that followed Chuck's indictment was heavy, thick with unspoken shame and the weight of Ethan's transgression. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed to recede, as if Willow Creek Memorial Park itself held its breath, waiting for a resolution, a sign of contrition. Ethan's head was bowed, his spiky hair doing little to conceal the flush of humiliation that spread from his neck to his ears. He could feel the eyes of his friends on him, no longer admiring, but wary, perhaps even a little disgusted. He could feel the silent judgment of the grieving widow and the unwavering, unyielding presence of the man whose hand still rested firmly on his shirt. "You have a choice, Ethan," Chuck said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, not with sympathy, but with the gravity of a teacher offering a difficult but crucial lesson. He had, in that moment, given Ethan back his name, a subtle reminder of his individual responsibility. You can continue down this path of casual cruelty, of disrespect, of bullying those you perceive as weaker, and you will find that it is a lonely, empty path, one that will ultimately lead to your own diminishment. He paused, letting the words resonate. Or he continued, "You can choose differently. You can learn from this. You can begin to understand that true strength isn't found in tearing others down, but in lifting them up. It's found in empathy, in compassion, in respect for the dignity of every human being, and for the sanctity of memory." He gave Ethan's shirt a slight, almost imperceptible tug, a silent command to look up. Reluctantly, Ethan raised his eyes, meeting Chuck's steady, penetrating gaze. "The first step on that different path," Chuck said, "is to acknowledge the harm you've done. To apologize, not because I'm telling you to, but because you understand deep down that it's the right thing to do. Not a mumbled, insincere excuse, but a genuine expression of remorse." He then slowly, deliberately, released his grip on Ethan's shirt. The sudden freedom seemed to surprise Ethan. He rubbed his shoulder, his expression a mixture of confusion, shame, and a nascent, unwilling respect for the man who had so completely dominated him without throwing a single punch. "The choice is yours," Chuck repeated quietly. He then took a step back, creating a small space between them, a space that Ethan could choose to fill with defiance or with the first difficult steps towards accountability. Eleanor had managed to gather most of the scattered gardenias. Her hands were trembling, and tear tracks still glistened on her cheeks. But her earlier look of profound distress was now mingled with a quiet awe as she watched the unfolding scene. She had expected, at best, that the teenagers would simply move on. She had never imagined such a powerful, articulate defense of her dignity, of James's memory. Ethan stood frozen for a long moment, the silence stretching. His friends watched him, their expressions unreadable. Kyle shifted his weight nervously. Leo chewed on his lower lip. Maya seemed to be holding her breath. Finally, Ethan took a shallow, shaky breath. He looked at the toppled vase, at the bruised flowers in Eleanor's hands. He looked at the quiet, unyielding figure of Chuck Norris. And then his gaze fell upon the simple granite headstone bearing the name Captain James R. Ashton. Something in his hardened exterior seemed to crack. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, a voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance, he said, I am sorry." He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes, for the first time, holding a flicker of something that might have been genuine remorse. "I'm truly sorry, Mom, for the flowers, and for what I said. It was wrong." Eleanor looked at Ethan, her gaze searching, discerning. His apology, though halting and imbued with the raw sting of his recent humiliation, felt different from his earlier mumbled excuses. There was a tremor in his voice, a downcast look in his eyes that suggested a dawning, painful awareness of his cruelty. She didn't speak immediately. allowing his words to settle in the quiet air of the cemetery. Chuck Norris stood by, a silent observer once more, allowing the interaction to unfold without further intervention. He had created the space for accountability. Now it was up to Ethan and Eleanor to navigate it. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally, her voice soft but clear, carrying a quiet dignity that had never wavered. "I appreciate your apology, young man." She didn't offer absolution, nor did she condemn him further. Her words were simple, accepting the apology for what it was, a first step. Ethan seemed to visibly deflate further, as if a heavy weight had been partially lifted, yet the burden of his actions clearly remained. He looked down at the scattered petals still on the grass, then back at the toppled vase. Without a word, he bent down, his movements awkward and unaccustomed, and began to carefully pick up the remaining bruised flowers. He then righted the vase, his hands fumbling slightly. His friends watched in stunned silence. This was a side of Ethan they had never seen, hesitant, contrite, performing an act of restitution, however small. Leo even took a tentative step forward, as if to help, then seemed to think better of it, remaining rooted to the spot. Kyle, however, did move. He walked over and, without looking at Ethan, began to help gather the stray petals, his earlier discomfort now channeled into a quiet, practical action. Maya watched them both, her expression unreadable, her brightly colored hair a stark contrast to the somber mood. Chuck observed this subtle shift with a flicker of something akin to hope in his eyes. The lesson was beginning to ripple outwards, beyond just Ethan. The power of example, the weight of moral accountability, was having an effect. When Ethan had gathered all he could, he held the bruised gardenias awkwardly in his hands. He looked at Eleanor, then at the grave. I can't fix what I did," he said, his voice still low, filled with a shame that was now palpable. "But I am sorry. He didn't deserve that. No one does." Eleanor offered him a small, sad smile. "No, he didn't," she agreed gently. "He was a good man, a brave man. He served his country with honor. He deserved respect, both in life and in his final resting place." She paused, then added, "Perhaps in time you will come to understand what that truly means." Chuck then spoke, his voice calm and steady, breaking the quiet intensity of the moment. "Understanding often begins with an act of humility, Ethan," he said, "and sometimes it continues with a commitment to learn, to grow, to ensure that such disrespect doesn't happen again. Not from you, and if you have the courage, not from others you see engaging in it." He looked at Kyle, who had finished collecting the petals and now stood holding them uncertainly. "That goes for all of you," Chuck added, his gaze encompassing Leo and Maya as well. "You have a choice in who you are and what you stand for. Choose wisely." The teenagers nodded, their earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by a somber, reflective mood. The afternoon that had begun with such careless cruelty had transformed into a profound, unexpected lesson in respect, empathy, and the quiet, unyielding power of moral courage. The grave of Captain James R. Ashton, once a target of derision, had become a silent, powerful teacher. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and soft lavender. The long shadows of the tombstones stretched across the manicured lawns, and a gentle evening breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oaks, creating a soothing, whispering sound. The intense, emotional charge of the confrontation had largely dissipated, leaving in its wake a heavy, contemplative quiet. Ethan, still holding the bruised gardenias, looked utterly lost. The swagger, the sneer, the aggressive confidence, all had been stripped away, revealing a young man adrift, confronting the unpleasant reality of his own actions. Kyle stood beside him, equally subdued, no longer seeking Ethan's approval, but seemingly engaged in his own internal reckoning. Leo and Maya lingered a little further back, their earlier amusement replaced by a somber unease. They had been passengers on Ethan's ride of arrogance, and now they were witnessing its crash. Chuck Norris allowed the silence to do its work. He knew that true learning often occurred in these quiet moments of reflection, after the storm of emotion had passed. He had planted the seeds of accountability. Whether they would take root and grow was now largely up to them. Eleanor, her composure regained, though her eyes still held the lingering sadness of her grief, now amplified by the afternoon's unpleasantness, gave a small, tired sigh. She looked at the flowers in Ethan's hand. "Perhaps," she said softly, "you could place them back in the vase, young man. They may be bruised, but they still represent a loving memory." Ethan looked at her, surprised by her gentle instruction. He nodded mutely and, with uncharacteristic care, began to arrange the damaged gardenias back into the small container. His movements were clumsy, but his intent seemed sincere. Kyle stepped forward and helped, his earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet desire to make some small amends. When they were done, the arrangement was imperfect, some petals torn, some stems bent, but it was an act of restoration, a symbolic gesture of repentance. Eleanor watched them, then offered a small, forgiving nod. "Thank you," she said simply. Chuck then addressed the group, his voice calm and even, carrying the weight of a final summation. "What happened here today," he said, "is a reminder that our words and actions have power. They can wound and they can heal. They can show disrespect or they can honor. The choice is always ours." He looked directly at Ethan. "You made a poor choice today, Ethan. A very poor choice. But you also, in the end, made a small step towards rectifying it. That, too, is a choice." He paused, his gaze sweeping over all four teenagers. "Don't forget this feeling. Don't forget the shame, the regret. Let it be a teacher. Let it guide you to make better choices in the future. Choose respect. Choose empathy. Choose to be the kind of person who defends dignity, rather than trampling on it." He then turned to Eleanor, his expression softening with a profound respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "I am truly sorry that your peace was so rudely disturbed. Your husband, Captain Ashton, and all who have served and sacrificed deserve our deepest gratitude and unwavering respect. May his memory always be a blessing." Eleanor's eyes welled up again, but this time the tears were not just of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your kindness, for your courage." Chuck simply inclined his head, a gesture of humble acknowledgement. His work here was done. He had not sought confrontation, but when it had presented itself, when a clear injustice had been committed, he had acted. He had defended the vulnerable, challenged the arrogant, and, perhaps most importantly, planted the seeds of a crucial lesson in the minds of a group of young people who desperately needed to learn it. As he turned to leave, walking with his characteristic quiet, unassuming stride back towards the stone bench to retrieve his book and cap, the teenagers watched him go, their expressions a mixture of awe, shame, and a dawning, profound respect. The old man they had dismissed, the stranger they had not recognized, had, in a few short minutes, irrevocably altered their perspective, leaving an indelible mark on their young lives. As Chuck Norris walked away, his figure receding into the deepening twilight of Willow Creek Memorial Park, a profound stillness settled over Ethan and his friends. They stood by Captain Ashton's grave, the imperfectly arranged, bruised gardenias, a poignant symbol of the afternoon's painful lesson. The loud, aggressive energy they had brought into the cemetery had been utterly extinguished, replaced by a somber, reflective quiet. Ethan stared at the headstone, the name Captain James R. Ashton, now etched not just in granite, but in his memory, linked forever with the shame of his actions and the quiet, powerful rebuke of the stranger. He felt a hollowness inside, a stark contrast to the inflated ego he had sported just an hour earlier. The admiration of his friends, which he had craved and cultivated through acts of bravado and bullying, now felt worthless, tainted. Kyle, who had helped rearrange the flowers, finally broke the silence. "Man," he said, his voice low and shaky, "that was intense." "Who was that guy?" Leo shook his head, his eyes still wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "I don't know, dude, but he wasn't just some random old guy. He was something else. Maya, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He was right," she said, looking at Ethan. "About everything. What you did. Ethan, it was really, really messed up." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't have the energy or the will. He simply nodded, his gaze still fixed on the grave. The weight of his disrespect, not just for Eleanor and her husband, but for the sanctity of the place, for the sacrifices of all veterans, was beginning to crush him. He thought of his own grandfather, a quiet man who rarely spoke of his time in the service, but whose eyes sometimes held a distant, haunted look. Had he ever been treated with such casual cruelty? The thought sent a fresh wave of shame through him. Eleanor, meanwhile, had finished her quiet farewells to James. She rose slowly to her feet, her movements a little stiff, but her earlier distress had eased, replaced by a sense of quiet vindication and a profound gratitude. She looked at the group of teenagers, her expression no longer one of pain, but of a gentle, sorrowful wisdom. "He was right, you know," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, echoing the stranger's earlier sentiments. "Respect is not a difficult thing to give. It costs nothing, yet it means everything, especially in a place like this, especially for those who gave so much." She paused, then offered them a small, sad smile. "I hope you all remember this day. Not just the unpleasantness, but the lesson. Learn from it. Be better." With that, she turned and began to walk slowly towards the cemetery gates, her small figure exuding a quiet strength that belied her age and her grief. The teenagers watched her go, her words, combined with the stranger's powerful intervention, leaving a lasting imprint. The afternoon had begun as a thoughtless, cruel escapade. It had ended as a profound, life-altering lesson, delivered not through violence or anger, but through the quiet, unshakable power of moral authority and the simple, enduring truth about human dignity. As for Chuck Norris, he had long since retrieved his book and cap and departed the cemetery, melting back into the anonymity of the evening. He sought no thanks, no recognition. He had simply done what he believed was right, what his conscience, honed by a lifetime of discipline and a deep-seated respect for honor, had compelled him to do. He knew that the world was full of Ethans, full of casual cruelty and thoughtless disrespect. But he also knew that it was full of Eleanors, full of quiet dignity and enduring love. And sometimes, all it took was one person to stand in the breach, to remind the former of the latter, and to ensure that the voices of respect and compassion were not entirely drowned out by the noise of arrogance and ignorance. The shadows lengthened in Willow Creek Memorial Park, and a profound peace, momentarily shattered, began to settle once more over the silent sentinels of stone, each one guarding a story, a memory, a legacy of a life lived, now resting in the quiet embrace of a hallowed ground that had, for one afternoon, become a classroom for the most important lessons of all.